Hello, we are live with Interchain Live. This is Ryan Munn in Vermont. I've got Jason Dispenza on with us today from EnLedger and Edge Energy. Where are you connecting from today, Jason?
Hey, Ryan. Yeah, I'm based here in Washington, D.C.
Right on. So yeah, Washington D.C. and you guys, the company, you guys have some people all over the country too, right?
Yeah, correct. We've got some folks in New York, and our CTO is in Denver. We got a couple of collaborators internationally as well, and it's been fun to sort of see a company grow more locally at edge energy level, and then see a second company grow in a more decentralized fashion. We can talk a little bit about some of the pluses and minuses of that maybe here.
Yeah, absolutely. So why don't we just kick it off a little bit? Tell us a little bit about kind of your background. Let's go back, what is it, 10, 15 years or something, where you kind of started to establish yourself in the energy industry.
Sure, no problem. Yeah, going back in time, I've spent almost 15 years in the energy sector. I was born in Washington, D.C., in fact. I went to school at UVA and studied economics and biochemistry and went through a little bit of investment banking before 2006 came around and Edge Energy got established. That company
Gotcha.
grew up to today, 50 or so employees, and it's focused mostly on building and constructing energy and renewable energy assets, both sort of in the residential and commercial space, focusing on projects that tackle efficiency savings in buildings, in addition to installing renewable energy and energy generating assets in homes and businesses. And about 8 or so years ago, we started to scale our state and utility program management. And Edge Energy is sort of a two-part company now, both as an EPC engineering and installation company for systems and projects, in addition to program management of utility types of rebate programs or quality assurance, and we somewhat liaise between the counties and the contractors and the homeowners. And it's really from that experience of program management and seeing the full layer cake, if you will, that makes a lot of these utility programs successful. It was the backdrop for why I started EnLedger about 3 years ago. EnLedger is a collaboration between me and my co-founder, Ryan Malecki, who's got a doctorate in nanoscience and is a computational researcher and supercomputer specialist, and he's based in Denver. We happened to meet on a chance encounter while I was on holiday in Iceland. And again, this is 3 years ago now, and we were talking about the data inefficiencies that exist in the energy sector and
Yeah.
how there's a lot of fragmentation across the US in terms of standards. And those standards are the things that hold together the utility programs on a region by region basis. And each of those programs is, again, an overlap between homeowner and local contractor and local quality assurance or state inspector types of interests. And not only are those interests not really being held together very well on a regional basis, there right now today is almost no standardization on a national basis, which I see as a really huge roadblock between bringing in new types of financing and funding to the work that is being done on a home by home or a building by building basis, as any one regional utility can piece a program together.
Right.
You kind of re-saying that is, we can take Maryland, for example. Maryland has a fairly successful project rebate program where an efficiency or a solar project can get some level of rebate from a Maryland entity. And those rebates are largely funded through legislation or renewable portfolio standards on a state by state basis. So the state, or a city across the U.S. has to create some level of legislation to fund a pool of money to pay for rebates.
Right.
And
So
that,
like Vermont has the Vermont Energy Investment Corp, which is combined with both Green Mountain Power and the Burlington Electric Department to work together with Efficiency Vermont to create these rebating programs and awareness programs for people to know about them and take advantage of them. But that's
correct. And all of this came around downstream of the Clean Power Plan, which was basically a federal guidebook that any state could look at a variety of options or methods to improve efficiency or resiliency or cost effectiveness or renewable saturation, any number of things. And most of those things, just like you mentioned there in Vermont, are set up under the Federal DOE and EPA Energy Star program with a sponsor that does some of the QA, like VEIC, that does the QA against a utility like Green Mountain Power's stakeholders or ratepayers who are taking advantage of the program. So there's usually like 3 entities involved in any one state area.
Yeah.
And my broad comment there is that these little regional programs are contingent upon local funding, and that's usually through a hard-fought, partisan argument in terms of how to accomplish that.
Right.
And my broad comment is that where is the connectivity back to corporate America, to Wall Street, to national level of interest or national level of marketing from manufacturers or trade associations or the public healthcare sector? And there's some very interesting connections between any one project in any one home and how that one project may make the house more energy efficient. But to try and justify doing the project from energy efficiency alone is somewhat leaving some return on investment on the table, in as much as a project like that impacts not only the energy efficiency, but if you're, for instance, installing a water filter or an air filter, or you're improving the lighting, that there are other public health benefits that are going unrecognized. Sure. So there's a lot of this new momentum building at sort of state and federal levels to try and connect these co-benefits of doing an efficiency project to other industries, whether it's healthcare or the insurance sector, that are largely benefiting from a more durable house or a healthier house or a house that's more comfortable and happier for occupants to live in. And how do you measure those benefits? Yeah, how do you measure those benefits, and how do you then connect funding channels back to these networks that exist across the U.S. That, again, are fairly stovepiped or fragmented by today's standards? So this kind of brings EnLedger and sort of my 2 initiatives together, in as much as we've been trying to work with nonprofit and NGOs and trade associations that do a lot of the energy worker credentialing. And we're trying to evolve some of the data standards that exist today between software companies to evolve a trade association-based data registry and use some more standardization at a registry level to enable these new funding channels.
Gotcha. So that's a mouthful.
That's a mouthful.
So one of the challenges is trying to find the similarities across these different jurisdictions so that we can come up with a model for the solution.
Yeah, this is like a great sort of blockchain / economics sort of pivot for the discussion, in as much as blockchain talks, and anyone that's in the sector talks all about consensus, mostly in consensus conceptually in terms of how computers that maintain the nodes of a blockchain maintain a consensus. Whereas when you start talking about how crypto economic principles may relate to a class of workers or a process in the real world, and suddenly you stop talking about the crypto side of blockchain and you start talking about the enterprise use case for blockchain, this is really where I've and my EnLedger has tried to maintain our focus in as much as the worker themselves, I see, is an important sort of component in a blockchain solution, in as much as blockchain is an enabling technology for workers of different types or governments of different types or syndicated and business networks of different types to pivot around data that they generally collaborate on, allowing all of those folks to remain competitors to each other, but having a data set that they all rely on to make themselves as a sector, as an industry, more transparent or more accurate with their data, and so forth.
If one grid manager has great connection, has a great resource for weather prediction and is able to protect itself or prepare for outages more effectively, that has a ripple effect with surrounding grids because the other grids are less likely to be impacted by those events. But even that data, you could argue that it's got value to any of those surrounding grids in terms of preparing for outages or surges in power supply or demand based on whatever those events may be. And so
correct. And I think that what you're getting at here is, economically speaking, the understanding and adoption and the belief in that a certain type of data can be viewed as, I wanted to say currency in as much as crypto and blockchain are trying to adopt
it's an asset.
These types of things as an asset or as a currency. And a currency only exists in as much as you've got a widespread belief among users or citizens that if they accept this currency on behalf of work that they've done, that they can then take it and spend it somewhere else. In this example that you brought up for weather data, that's data as a currency applies here in as much as if you've got a bunch of algorithms or you've got a bunch of credit markets or you've got a bunch of third-party finance companies that are arbitraging efficiency or other types of resources that may have to be computed using weather data, then suddenly that weather data itself needs to be commonly understood as being a rock solid oracle, a type of data that everyone can bank as if it was a currency. Right. Maybe not bank is the right word, but depend upon is the right word. Well, in as much, that hasn't been changed, hasn't been tampered with, that there isn't a different version of weather data that different algorithms in a different sector might be using and so forth. And some of the things for energy assets that pertain to this is the size of your solar system and the direction it points to south and the tilt angle and the shading factor and stuff that doesn't change frequently. And then in the energy program world where you're doing efficiency, the stuff that doesn't change are the physical attributes about your house. If you have a house and you've bought it and refinanced it and you've done an energy project a few years later, you may have had 3 to 6 or 10 different professionals come in and remeasure your house and kind of using this silly example of what's the square footage of your dining room. If you've got 6 different answers to the square footage of your dining room, then we don't have consensus. Right. So that's kind of full circle, kind of where we're coming with these utility programs, is that there are little minutia aspects of data that around which these networks pivot. And stuff as silly as the square footage of your dining room or the number of windows in your house or the type of heating and cooling and appliances and so forth that goes into an energy audit and an efficiency project. There's hundreds of data fields there. And so keeping that standardized and then keeping that accessible and then finally here in terms of democratization and privacy of data, keeping that kept private and on behalf of the homeowner in a decentralized model is sort of really where the cutting edge discussions of GDPR and where the utilities and the healthcare sectors start to overlap and so forth.
Right, because there's all kinds of utility to that for the individual homeowner who wants to maybe do an upgrade or sell the house. But at the same time, you've got the banks that want to mortgage against that property, and they want to be able to have a standardized data set to value their or assess their risks or value the capital that they're backing their loans with. But then you've also got census information for municipal governance, and being aware of the overall data or overall needs and capabilities of the local infrastructure is key to making bigger decisions. So, while one person may say, oh, I want this data for, so that I can upgrade my kitchen and put new counters in, that data can then turn around and be reused over and over again. Instead of having 6 different people over 10 different years come in and measure stuff in your house, we can have one reliable source of data and a way to sort of validate that it is, verify that it's been validated.
Exactly. And it's kind of, funny in these discussions to talk about decentralization, versus centralization. In many ways,
you're not going to decentralize your house.
Well, I think you're correct. Right. I think what I'm trying to say is we need a common tool in as much as we somewhat need to centralize the lookup. Whereas we need to decentralize the storage and maintenance of the network so that the storage and maintenance of the network is not contingent upon government funding or legislative things at the federal or state level and so forth. I see that the decentralization affects how a network of workers can maintain a data set for themselves that becomes valuable to other industries. But in terms of workflow, there's an aspect of centralization in as much as we're all going to start looking at the same data set, versus all these data lakes or data pools that exist regionally, but are not necessarily synchronizable. And that same problem is pervasive and well documented in the healthcare sector, in terms of EMR and EHR. Between hospitals or between insurance networks, and the exact same fragmentation exists in the utility space that's been doing a lot of work in homes and businesses. And meanwhile, as you mentioned, loan or mortgage companies and real estate companies have typically had a completely separate network outside of that, doing inspections, and then insurance and county code and county tax offices have had no connections to this type of data. So I see us emerging into a very new paradigm here coming up.
Absolutely. So what can people, what can sort of average people be doing? I mean, I know that, I've been involved with some legislative initiatives and things like that, but, what can people do to sort of participate or start pushing things in the direction that will help us accomplish these broader goals of having better integrated systems across jurisdictions?
Sure. Well, we're very early in any level of adoption of blockchain in the U.S. and besides the technological adoption curve, we've got ourselves legislatively still thinking very regionally. Mm-hmm. And if I wouldn't say necessarily that any average citizen can necessarily do too much with blockchain for enterprise grade ideas, but if you are in the C-suite of a utility, or if you are a legislator that's trying to evolve a program, or more broadly saying, if you are the hub of a hub and spoke business model or a network or NGO. If you happen to be a hub, then there are many things to think about. If you happen to be on the outside of a spoke of a hub and spoke model, then you might end up participating in a blockchain or in a data type of technology that doesn't exist today, but that needs to evolve more from this network support perspective than necessarily kind of distilling up from any one particular company in a network of companies. Broadly speaking.
We need American leadership to recognize their responsibility as leaders and sort of open the book, if you will, and start learning where this applies to their realm, whatever their sort of oversight is. We want them to start learning how these tools apply to what they're doing.
Yes, and if your business network or hub and spoke model, if you will, involves a slice of government, whether it's municipal or county or state or federal, then you've got a complicating factor, and you have a seat at the table that they're obviously going to need to take in the development of what consensus or what the technology needs to be able to do for the network. But more broadly speaking, I think it's a matter of competitors coming to the round table and everyone being able to see everyone else at the round table and throwing all of the chits and the requirements and the concerns into the middle so that a solution can emerge that ideally encompasses all of them. And can again unite competitors in as much as competitors are sharing data or competing on data, and if they share and compete on a standardization of that data, then suddenly they all become cheaper to operate, or they all become more interconnected, or they all can effectuate some of this change together. So it's a very communications heavy, planning heavy, bringing stakeholders into group settings and getting the buy-in from, all corners of an industry in order to somewhat, evolve into this new paradigm.
It's funny because it's like what we're really trying to do is create a truly sustainable deregulation of the energy infrastructure in the U.S., where lots of states have deregulated and allowed competition, and yet where it's the places where they haven't deregulated that in some ways it may be easier to actually get a system put in place that allows more sort of free market collaboration in the industry. Because I know with Vermont being pretty much Green Mountain Power everywhere, that actually makes it a bit easier for us to get something across potentially in terms of a universal sort of protocol layer solution to allow microgrids and solar panels and cooperative solar fields and things like that to all interconnect on the same network. I'm curious though, are there other jurisdictions that you've been paying attention to outside of the U.S., most likely maybe island nations or something like that are doing particularly that are really on the forefront of some of this energy technology?
The European Union, I think, is probably the furthest along in terms of adopting blockchain in the energy sector. They've set up enough standards to allow for peer-to-peer trading in different portions of Europe. And again, I think that it depends. The energy sector is so big, and there's so many interests, and there's so many goals, either on a broad scale or on a very micro nano scale in any particular area, whether that's load balancing or whether that's seeing a bigger saturation of renewables or whether that's enabling electric vehicles or time of use types of billing structures, or if you're in a deregulated market, sort of how wholesalers interact with retailers. Some of the common denominators are the workers who do credentialed work or the actual amount of delivered power to a device. No one should be arguing with the amount of electrons that got delivered in a time frame to a home or to a building or to a car. That's the kind of stuff that needs to be either stored or accessible in a blockchain. If that region wants multiple software companies or user interfaces, provided by companies or funding sources, or if they're trying to open up methods for more projects to happen, or they're trying to open up, new pathways for software companies to redisplay that data in useful applications for homeowners or that kind of thing. So it's hard about the energy sector without kind of falling from 10,000 feet up right back to ground level and then having to pop back up again, sort of use case by use case.
Yep.
But you asked about island nations and adoption. A closed population of homes, on an island nation in the Caribbean, for instance, it's an example of where, blockchain might be able to take an area that needs a variety of use cases or a variety of goals accomplished at once And by analogy, it's like an African nation going from no phones in the hands of every homeowner or citizen to everyone having a cell phone, totally skipping through this telephone wire based network. And in terms of deploying an energy or utility type of program to fix up homes for efficiency or to get new types of solar or renewable assets out into the wild, that same type of analogy exists in a smaller population or a closed population where you can effectuate legislative changes and technological changes and worker credentialing and training sort of all at once. And then you sprinkle in project finance and quality assurance, once you've got some momentum there.
Awesome. Awesome. So what is on the horizon for EnLedger in 2019?
So, my personal goals are to see some standardization continue to evolve at the national level. And right now in the Energy Star program for residential homes, there's 110 million homes in the US. And there's a surprisingly small number that have been through energy auditing or any sort of retrofit type of review. I think we're talking 3 or 4% of homes over decades of work.
Right.
And so there's a lot of building infrastructure that still needs to be improved just to tackle low-hanging fruit. And so what I'm very interested in seeing is some standardization that can bring that type of program into areas that are right now without a program. About 2/3 of the US has a program, leaving 1/3 of the states in the US without any rebate program or any quality assurance against this type of work. And that exists because there's not standardized or not consistent maybe funding in order to pull a program through like that. So with some national standardization, you've got the ability to bring in national size funding channels from CSR, corporate sustainability types of initiatives or impact initiatives, or just large Fortune 100, 500 companies that already do national level advertising. And, just kind of while I'm on the soapbox, the cost of a 1 or 2 minute Super Bowl ad approaches the state budget of a funding of a rebate program on a yearly basis.
Yeah.
So suddenly, like, how do we fix all the Flint, Michigan water filters? Well, that's a painful program. That's a painful problem to have seen persist in Michigan. And if there had been some connections for local plumbers and energy auditors and energy workers that do that stuff already, back through quality assurance networks and back to maybe some of the CSR or national types of funding, then that problem could have been fixed faster without somewhat of the government having to be involved.
Right.
So, long story short, what's on the horizon line for EnLedger? Well, for me personally here in DC and trying to bridge sort of my two focuses, I definitely want to see more programs nationwide, more diverse funding options nationwide, seeing connections from tangential industries like healthcare. If you're improving the air quality of a home, what's the ROI to the public health sector for all the occupants in that house living in cleaner air for the next 75 to 200 years of a house's useful lifespan? So there's a lot of big questions there to kind of combine. And then I definitely wanted, sorry, Ryan, to continue talking here, but the other very interesting product for us in terms of EnLedger's launch is community solar or community-owned assets more broadly speaking. And we're focusing in the real estate sector for commercial real estate, and solar and microgrid or battery systems in the energy space. So, what type of software and what types of protections does a grandmom or an accredited investor need if they're going to consider buying into a community solar or a real estate venture that's set aside, a portion of the capital for crowdfunding? How do you maintain the crowd's interests and protect them? And how does that get manifested in the real world, legally speaking, and so forth? These are all very current issues that the industries are tackling in addition to the blockchain community tackling.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, I know that's a lot of the conversation I'm having up in Vermont around using this municipality infrastructure or entity to help support this kind of building of infrastructure and bringing in the mind share and the capital to, get microgrids in place or get cooperative solar or get broadband fiber optic into rural communities. It's interesting looking at, how do we navigate what people say is something new and untested, but the reality is that, whether we were using a piece of paper 100 years ago to represent a debt contract or equity in a stock, or we're using a digital token today, it really isn't different. There's really not that much that's new in this. It's just in some of the tools we're using to do these same things. But there is the ability to get more and more creative with how we define these contracts and these tokens and these assets and how they interact with each other. And I think it opens a lot of doors, but we definitely need to have that conversation across the public and private sectors to find these solutions that'll really take hold and last.
100%. And it's not just about figuring out how to do them, but it's also how to help them scale.
Right.
Community solar is an example of that. Here in Maryland, there's only 2 or 3 community solar projects that have been put into production in the last 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
And I don't see that as a success. And some of the issue there is that while there is good intent of a new model where fractional ownership of a system makes sense, and there is a little bit of demand on consumers to want to invest in solar assets like that, you've got all kinds of downstream questions. What's the collateral? What's the underwriting and the likelihood of default? How do you protect and enable the consumers voting and other tax equity or depreciation or certificate types of rights and payments? And this also falls outside of what any local utility may help a solar developer complete for any particular project. So again, going back to the scalability issue, I see that as some of this data becomes commonplace and some data gets structured into a blockchain here or there, that there'll be a lot of opportunity for companies to draw some of those connections together and to help standardize some of these more conceptually difficult things to do today. And so scalability for us in community solar, has been a big driver for why we're focusing there first.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really the key to so many things is that figuring out how to incentivize people to participate so that you can create a solution from the bottom up. Because, it's too easy to miss some detail or have something sort of blindside you 10 years later when we, continue to try to implement sort of top-down solutions. I want to comment before we break away. You kind of made me think of something a little earlier. You mentioned Flint, Michigan. It seems like there's a play here we can push to legalize blockchain-based gambling and then push out, a fantasy sports solution that says somehow, gamble here by your choice so that the people of Flint don't have to gamble when they drink their water, and use the proceeds to try to help solve the problem there. But it comes down to that. We need these collaborative tools so that we can solve problems across humanity, right? I mean, we all have really the same basic human needs and challenges. And whether we're solving an energy problem in one place or a water problem in another place, there's actually the same fundamental issues, right? There was obscurity, there was obfuscation in the process of how things were managed, administrated to begin with. There's a lack of accountability and how it's actually being addressed and dealt with after the fact. And ultimately, it's the same sets of technology that are going to solve those problems in various industries and sectors. And it's really all supply chain, whether we're talking about food or water or electricity. It's about having that transparent, accountable supply chain and being able to hold to that.
100%. I might not have used the word gambling there, but the concept of a community trying to get together to solve a problem or to encourage a social or societal benefit that would make their community better, or
Yeah.
make a neighboring community or one across the other side of the planet better. I mean, I see that there's already charitable giving, and that's been happening for decades, and that's why nonprofits and NGOs exist. But when an NGO only gets 8 cents out of every dollar deployed to the benefit they're trying to solve, then suddenly there is a problem. And I agree with you, Ryan, that there's a lot of space available for connecting of social giving back to a more transparent type of method where you don't have a lot of that wasted administrative cost in the mix. You can verify whether something was installed or not based on the data from the worker who was there that day, and it having been archived correctly, instead of having to employ a half a dozen people in between that worker and some data set that then was made accessible, or not made accessible to the folks that donated money to the cause to start with. And I think that kind of touches on EnLedger's much broader long-term plan, is that while we're focusing in connecting sort of one societal pillar to the next in some of these broader spectrum things, that ideally you would be able to one day have the nuanced methodology of any particular goal, a community goal, in terms of an idea being posted and then collecting funding and momentum, and enough funding is generated to create a training method and a verification method, and to hire, if you will call it, hire workers or people in the area that the benefit needs to be deployed, and putting out an app so that those workers and those trained people can verify when they've deployed any one unit of measure of the benefit. That's a very universal concept, and I see that that's a great way to not necessarily to redistribute wealth, but to redistribute good intention.
Right.
And if you look at our website, I think that's up right now. Enabling a brighter future is spinning off this concept that societies have been traditionally built on fines and penalties, and not so much off rewarding good behavior. And that's where I see blockchain, for the average citizen really making a huge impact in the next decade. Is in that they can either be a deployer of good intention, or a worker to verify the benefit has been installed correctly, or if you're in a distressed situation, you're the recipient of some of that, and
everything you're talking about comes down to assets. These data sets being treated as assets. We have these huge social media companies right now. I won't name any names, but I don't believe any of them have data listed on their balance sheet. And that's a fundamental problem right now, is that we have lots of data floating around. It is an actual asset. It is utilized to make money by companies. And there is a real question as to who actually owns that data, because in many cases, these companies claim that it is our data, not theirs, that they're protecting it for us. And so there's a whole kind of enlightening that needs to happen there, where we, as people, as consumers and participants in these systems, are enabled by the tools, but then still have the responsibility to exercise these tools in order to protect our individual data rights or our public data rights, and ultimately ensure that the monetization that occurs on that data is distributed effectively. So, whether it's coming back to the people actually producing the data or creating the system that enables the value, or it's going to assist other related problems that can be solved by that monetization. So it's pretty exciting to see what's going to happen in the next few years, and 10 to 20 years as these things play out. But it's obvious to see that society is changing after thousands of years of the penalties and fines, the stick and whips kind of way of doing things. We've got some pretty exciting tools to take advantage of what we're now learning and observing as behavioral economics and sort of game theory, and how we can really take control of our results.
Yeah, it's a convergence of all of that you just mentioned, in addition to sort of Web 2.0 crowdsourcing type of ideas, whether that's
Yeah.
crowdsourcing the idea itself or whether that's crowdsourcing the labor to deploy the idea. And it's also combining like the gig economy and freelancers and opening all kinds of new channels for individual people. The
Yeah.
flexibility and the ability to receive benefit or trade your skills or to trade your time, is going to be more fluent than we've ever seen before. So I'm very excited about, sort of seeing some of those types of things happen. And in the meantime, our focus, at EnLedger in the blockchain space is to try and make a template out of the workflows that are already happening. And once those rails are somewhat well built, then suddenly all of these other, ideas or making a hard idea into a more universally applicable thing. That's sort of like second generation. That's like Web 1.0 versus Internet 2.0 versus Internet 3.0 in terms of where I see blockchain going over the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, right on, right on. Well, hey, Jason, it's been great chatting with you today. Gonna cut us off here, but I think we could probably do this again, probably get a few more hours of conversation in. But I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today, and I'm really excited to see what EnLedger is doing moving forward. And I hope everybody else will hop on there, dig into your site a little bit more, and pay attention both to what you're doing, but also to what they can do locally to help move these conversations forward in their own communities.
Yeah, I'm passionate about seeing this change come around. Ryan, thank you for inviting us to the show. We're excited to see what you're going to be doing there in Vermont as well. And, more broadly speaking, education and channels like this are incredibly important, towards bringing attention to these types of issues and then also driving good policy and good technology forward. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, you're welcome. Thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to talking to you soon.